All right, welcome back to another video. We're going to be taking a look at something really quick and really simple today. We are going to be taking a look at the process of importing a series of assets to be used together in Unreal and creating materials and assigning them to those assets. I've already got this imported in the engine here. This is a Colt 1911 that I've built. I'm going to be re-importing this and setting up the materials as an example. I find myself in my content folder, and I've gone and created a new empty folder here in which I'm going to be using for my 1911. I'm first going to create a folder for each of the categories of objects I'm going to be importing. I have meshes. I'll create a folder for textures in which I'm also going to be placing my materials. And then eventually I'm going to be creating a blueprint class. This blueprint class is going to control what the weapon looks like when we use it in game. So I'm going to call this blueprints like so. The next stage is to import our assets. In the meshes folder, I will right click and hit import. And here I'm going to choose my 1911 FBX. Now, seeing as that this is a rigged model, I'm going to want to use this as a skeletal mesh. So I'm going to make sure that the skeletal mesh is checked off. I want to make sure that I'm importing the mesh. Otherwise, we would just be importing animations or the skeleton. I'm also going to leave the skeleton blank. This is going to ensure that the system generates a skeleton from the imported model rather than assigning it to a skeleton already in the engine. In the next set of settings, I'm going to leave the vertex color. I'm not using that, so we'll leave it at its default. I'm not going to change anything else in here except for I want to make sure I am importing normals since I've gone and set them up on this asset already. And that I don't want to compute weighted normals, and I'm just going to use the built-in generated method. I'm not generating normals anyway, so that shouldn't matter. I'm going to be turning off my physics asset. If I leave this turned on, Unreal will generate a cylinder, cylinder part sphere that it will use as a collision, and that's not even the right shape for what we would use as a handgun. So there's no point in generating that. I can go and add a physics asset later if I plan on having this weapon fall to the floor and rattle around. I don't have any animations in this file, so I'm not going to use any animations. I'm not going to be transforming this object neither. I like where it is in my scene, and I'm happy with the way that it's going to work. Next, materials. I want to make sure that I am not searching for materials. I am not importing or creating materials, and I'm not importing nor creating textures. I'm going to set that all up myself. I don't even want those materials in this folder. If I choose to have that turned on, Unreal will generate some material balls here, and I don't actually want those. So with that all set, I'll hit import. The mesh will come in and it's going to tell me it could not find a bind pose. Now this is because this is a skeletal mesh and it's looking for when the skeleton was bound to the geometry. I'm not actually doing that, so I don't really care about this warning. Next, I'll go and take a look to make sure that my geometry is indeed looking the way that I expect it to look, and that in my material list, I should have the materials the way that they were assigned inside of Maya. First, I have the material for the actual weapon itself. This is called M1911. And then I've got a material here that foolishly I forgot to rename inside of Maya. Thus, it has imported the name from Maya. I'm going to go in and take the time to rename this so that it better defines what it is that this material is going to be texturing. If I go and turn the highlight option on or the isolate option on, we can see exactly what this is affecting in our scene. This is my Picatinny rail, so I'm going to go and name this rail. I can save this asset and close that out. Next, I'll bounce over to the textures folder and I can start importing the textures for this asset. Under import, I'll go to my textures folder and I'll start grabbing the textures that are needed for this asset. Now I actually have several, and so I'm going to need to bring those all in. I have a 1911 AORM map, an ambient occlusion, a roughness and metallic pack temp map. I'm going to be using that. I have my default 1911 texture. I'm actually going to swap this out with this one. I think I like this one a little bit better. And I'll use this one here. So we have the Colt base color, the Colt normal, and the Colt ARM. Again, I have varying versions of these things that I can use here. It doesn't really matter which I use. I've gone and textured this thing several times over, so that's why there are so many textures here. I'm going to go and pull this in, and these 3 textures are now going to be used. Now, Unreal detected the normal map when I imported this. It took a look at the colors of this texture, and it said, wait, hold on. You're using this in a very specific way, and it's going to be a little bit broken if you use it as a default texture. So what the engine did is it changed the compression mode on that image to be that of a normal map, meaning it's now compressing the red, green, and blue channels independently of each other and then recombining them back to be this purple image. That way the normals look pretty accurate to what we expect them to look like. The ARM also needs to be edited, but Unreal didn't detect that that was what this image was. It actually thinks that it's this pink and orange and purple or green map here as some kind of color image, and that's not what we want either. To affect this or to change this, I'm going to double click on this image, and I'm going to ensure that my sRGB under my texture slot here is turned off. This is going to ensure that each of the red, green, and blue channels are compressed separately, kind of like they are in the normal map. Nothing needs to be changed on our base color image. From here, we can now start generating a material that we will use to apply to the asset. First, excuse me, I will right-click and create a new material. This material I will call MM_, that's standing for master material. And I'm going to call this one PBR. And the reason for that is this is going to be a simple PBR material. It's going to contain only just these 3 texture types. In here, I can now assign some texture types to where they belong. The normal, the base color, and our packed ARM map. So I'm just going to go and organize these in a little bit of a clean manner here. We'll go and put them a little bit over here. And then we'll grab our RGB. This is the color export from our texture, the color output. And I'll plug that into the base color input in the PBR material. I'll take the RGB out from our normal map and plug that into the normal slot of the material. And then I can go and start plugging in our packed ARM. Again, that's A in the red channel for ambient occlusion, R in the green channel for roughness, and M in the blue channel for metallic. Now, if you've gone and placed your images in a different order, then you need to plug them in accordingly, or this image will not work in the way that you intend it, and you're actually going to see some funky things happening on your material wall. Since I always use this layout, this format, ARM, it means that I kind of always know where these things are supposed to go. The next thing I want to address is the fact that I don't want too many materials inside of Unreal. Here, we have just our first master material PBR, and that's going to be assigned to the gun. But I have a couple of other assets that I'm going to be importing as well, and I don't want to generate identical materials just with swapped out textures. That's going to be too performance heavy. It's going to make Unreal compile each one of those material balls. And we've all seen Unreal compile for, hours on end. So what I would like to do is I would like to reuse this material a couple of different times. To do that, I'm going to take my texture sample here that is referencing the color image, and I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to convert it to a parameter object. Now, a parameter object is something that can be edited in an instance or at runtime during the game. I'm going to call this base color, and that's because that's what this texture sample is actually referencing. It's plugged into my base color. I'll adjust the next texture sample as well, converting it to a parameter, calling this one normals. And again, it's plugged into the normal slot of my material. Finally, my AORM, I'm going to convert this to a parameter and name it AO for ambient occlusion, R for roughness, and M for metallic. That's actually the order going down the colors. I can now save this out and close it, and that material is now going to work the way that I want it to. Now, one of the things that I'm in the habit of doing is that PBR, it's often easy to forget which textures, if you had a lot of assets in your scene, which textures you're actually using on this asset. So I'm going to create an instance to begin with. And I'm going to call this MI, material instance. I'll put an underscore, and then I'll name the asset here that I'm texturing. This is my Colt 1911. That's actually what the textures assigned to this instance are going to be used for, so I don't need to go and change this any further. Let's go and apply this to our asset. I'm going to go back to my meshes. I'm going to open the 1911, and here I have the two materials that I want to adjust. There are two methods you can use to assign a material here. You can use the drop down and search through all of the materials currently in Unreal to assign the one you want. You can also do a little bit of a search. So if I click the drop down and type 1911 for 1911, there's my Colt 1911 material that I just assigned, and it should appear on the weapon in exactly the way that we expect it. The other way that we can do this is by going to the material again and dragging it onto the slot. Now again, Unreal is color coded, so we can actually see exactly what nodes belong where. The textures are this kind of orangish red color, and the materials are green. You can see that the master material is actually a bright green, and the material instances are a slightly darker green, both of which can go onto these slots. You'll see if I try and put it somewhere where it's not allowed to go, you get this little red outline here indicating, no, you can't put that there. Okay, so that's pretty good. I need to go and create the material here for the Picatinny rail that I've got attached to the underside of my Colt. So let's go and do that. I'm going to right click in my texture slot here, go to import, and I'm going to go into the same folder and grab my Picatinny rail textures. Here is the ARM, the color, and the normal. Once these are imported, we're going to go ahead and close this window. We're going to need to adjust. Again, it detected the normal map. It did not detect the ARM. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to turn this off to, again, make sure that it's giving us the right values. Now I'll make an instance of our master material. I'll name it mi_rail. I'll open up the instance editor. And now we're going to see a little bit of a different material editor. Here, instead of the wire graph that we can use to plug things in and affect it in a certain way, we now actually just have our parameters that were created. We only created just the three of them, ARM, base color, and normals, and Unreal has actually gone and placed them in alphabetical order. So ARM, base color, and normal. So we can actually see A, B, N. Now, you can actually reorder these if you want them in a different order. Sometimes when you get a lot of parameters in a single material, it actually be a little more difficult to find things. In the master material, when you select one of your parameters, inside of the properties here on the left, we have a sort priority node. And the sort priority node is a list that tells it where in the positioning here you want it to be. By default, everything is set to 32, so it just puts them in alphabetical order. If you wanted the base color to be first, you could assign this to be any number smaller than 32, and that would move it up in this list. I don't really care about the positioning. I'm only going to be using 3 materials, so I'll leave them as they are. Next, I need to replace my texture samples with the ones that I'm going to be using for the rail. That's pretty easy to do. I'm just going to grab the orange one and place it in the ARM. The base color can go into the base color, and the normal can replace the normal. I can now close that material. I can go back to my mesh, open this up, and here we find our mesh needs our material. Now, instead of using the drop down here as I did the first time, I'll show you the process of dragging this in. So I'll grab my rail material, drag it onto the spot, and let it go. And now the textures for the rail appear in the place where they should. This asset is now good to go, and I can now go and start creating some of the other assets I'm going to need to make. I have 2 more assets I would like to import in order to use them here, and I'm going to go and drag those in now. So I'm going to right-click and say import. I'm in my meshes folder. I'm going to go back to my FBX folder here where I keep all of my assets, and I'm going to bring in the laser and the suppressor. I've got 2 attachments I want to put on this weapon. So excellent. Now, we're not going to be using a skeletal mesh. These are far more simple assets and don't have any moving components. So I don't need them to actually be animated. I don't need them to be rigged in any way. And it'll be a little simpler here to bring them in as static meshes. In the properties for my static meshes, there's a few things I would like to adjust. First, making sure I'm not using a skeletal mesh. I also don't really need to worry about collision. I'm not doing that for this project. I don't care if the gun passes through anything, so I'm going to leave that off as well. The next thing that I'm interested in is the category here called Combine Meshes. Now, if you don't see this right away, there's a little drop-down window, a little drop-down arrow, that'll open up the remaining properties here for this static mesh. The Combine Meshes button is there to combine all of the separate pieces of 3D geometry that you've included in your single FBX file. So this means that things like screws won't become a separate mesh. They will actually be contained within the main object. Sometimes you want things to be separate. Sometimes you want them to be all inclusive. And I'm going to combine them here because I just want one asset to come in. If I scroll down, I also want to make sure that this is not going to do anything texture or material wise. I do not want it to do anything with that. Finally, I'll hit import and it'll offer me the same settings again here. I could have also hit import all and it will just agree to those settings for every asset imported. I now have my suppressor and my laser. I will head back over to my textures, right click and import, and we'll bring in the textures for those two pieces as well. Under my textures folder, I have my 3 laser textures and I have my 3 suppressor textures. I'll hit import and those will appear now in my content as well. Again, the normal maps getting detected and being adjusted accordingly. The ARMs are not. I will go and turn the sRGB off on both of those, again, so that they render correctly. We can now generate our materials for the other 2 attachments. Finding my master material, I'm going to create a new instance, which I'll call mi_suppressor. And I will create another material instance, which I'll call mi_laser. I can now go and assign the appropriate textures to each of these materials. First, enabling the checkboxes so that it knows I want to edit those textures, and then go and applying the right ones to the right position here. I'm going to go and drag down my content browser so that I can see both the editor and all of the content. And now I just need to find the 3 textures. Here they are. Here, laser and laser and laser. I'll close that one and I'll open up the suppressor and I will turn on the 3 nodes here, adding now my suppressor textures to the right spots. Like so. Now I'll head back to my meshes folder and we can go and assign these textures the right way. Head over to the textures. This is the laser. I'm going to hit F here to focus in on the object. I'm also going to adjust my camera speed. Since this is a tiny little asset here, I don't need the camera to be moving really, really quickly. I'm going to grab the laser material and drag it into the green slot here, and we now get the laser texture appearing properly. If it does not appear the way that you intended it to look, you probably need to make sure that your UVs are exactly the way that you intended them to look. Here are the UVs for my laser asset, and they look exactly as they did inside of Maya, with the exception of the fact that they're now triangulated. I can close that, go back into my meshes, and we'll adjust our suppressor. Again, I'm going to hit F in the viewport to focus on the asset. I'm going to turn down my camera speed so that I can, again, position the camera in a way that I can make sure that this asset looks the way that it's intended to look once I drag my suppressor material into the right slot. And indeed, this looks the way I intended it to look. I will save this, close it, and I now am ready to actually combine these assets into a blueprint. I'm going to head to my blueprint folder, and I'm first going to create a blueprint class. The type of blueprint class that we're creating here is an actor class. The actor class is meant to be an object that can be in the game, whether it be a weapon or a building or a blade of grass. Anything that is an actor that can be spawned in the game or placed somewhere in the world, this is what an actor is. And that's what we're going to be doing here. So I'm going to click the actor button. This is going to create the little thumbnail here in my content browser. And I'm going to rename this again in a way that is going to make it easy to detect what it is that we're doing. I'm going to hit BP, blueprint. I'll do underscore, and this is going to be my weapon class. Now I'm calling a weapon class because I'm going to give the player the ability to swap in and out different things on this weapon at their choosing. I'm not going to call this 1911 because one of the things I'm going to give the player the ability to swap in and out is the weapon itself. If I open up this blueprint editor, you're going to see that we get a viewport here. This is looking at the asset by itself. By default, there's something called a default scene route here in the scene. And this is just this little image of a white sphere. This is so you can see the asset inside of the world when you place it somewhere in your map. We don't actually need this. We can get rid of it. It needs to be here now so that the blueprint is not completely empty. But once we start adding things, we can actually get rid of this if we want. It's not mandatory. This thing is not going to render in game. We're not going to see this in the engine when the player is playing. We'll see it only while we're constructing our scene. The first thing I want to add is my weapon, and the weapon was a skeletal mesh. And so I'm going to go to Add Component, and I'm going to type in skeletal. Here's the skeletal mesh at the bottom, and I'm going to add that into my scene. I'm going to name this Weapon Mesh, and now I actually have a skeletal mesh component in my scene. Now we can't see anything. There doesn't appear to have been anything changed in the world here. Everything still looks exactly the way it did a moment ago. The reason for that is that currently, with the weapon mesh selected, in the details pane on the right, there's nothing assigned to the skeletal mesh. Now, this isn't always the case when you create a skeletal mesh component. If you had something selected in your folder that was a skeletal mesh, and you created a skeletal mesh, it would actually assign that to the property. It would think that that's what you're intending to place in your scene. I actually prefer to leave it empty for now because I'm going to go and adjust things in a moment. The next thing that I want to do is add my two attachments. Now on this weapon, I have two attachments, one on the barrel, one on the Picatinny rail, and I want to be able to add those at my choosing. So I'm going to hit Add Component, and those were both static meshes. So I'm going to type in static and choose static mesh from the list. Here, I'm going to call this one of two names. I'll call this one barrel attachment, and I will add another one. You can see that because I had the weapon mesh selected, the barrel attachment here is actually parented to it. That is what we want, but I'm going to show you here. I'm going to make another one, and this time I'm going to have nothing selected when I create the static mesh, and I'll show you the difference between them. This one is not parented. You can see it doesn't fall under the weapon mesh. It's actually directly below it without the little arrow here. So this one is going to be rail attachment. Okay, so I now have two attachments. This one should be parented as well. And I created it here, it's not parented, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on it and drag it onto the weapon mesh. This parents it. You can actually use the little arrow here to shrink or open up its children so you can actually see the list. If they still appear when it's shrunk down, you know they're not children of that asset. I can go and save this, and I'm going to now go and give these things some default values. So this is going to be pretty easy here. I'm going to grab my weapon mesh, and I'll grab my 1911 and place it there. I now should see in the editor here, my 1911 exactly where it's meant to be. The center of the grip, where it's going to be placed in the player's hand, is in the center of the handle, exactly where it should be. Okay, let's go and take our barrel attachment. This is the suppressor. I'll place that on. Well, it's not exactly where I want it, but it's a start. I'm then going to go to my rail attachment, and I'll bring the laser out here. And the laser, too, is kind of not in the right position. The reason these assets find themselves where they do is that they are all in relation to the grid, the origin, the 000 mark of our world. This is where these assets were exported from the 3D package where they were created. They show up in relation to that origin in the 3D engine. In order to move them, we're going to go and reconfigure the skeleton for our weapon in order to create some sockets that are in the right place where we want them to be. To do this, I'm in my mesh folder, and I'm going to double click on my skeleton. When I do this, I now have an editor that is going to show me my mesh, and a list of bones associated with it. Now, I didn't actually rig this weapon. I just parented everything to the asset called body underscore low, which is also not the name I intend this thing to have in the end. These were actually the names that were used for Substance Painter. And so I do need to go and rename these at some point. The fact that the hierarchy exists, that these were parented to that asset, is why this came in as a skeletal mesh. The hierarchy was read as a skeleton. Now, you can actually go and do things with this and make it work. You know, we could go into move, and I can go and grab the slide, and I could actually go and move the slide. Now, that moves the right way, but you can see it's taking with it, or it's not taking with it, the elements that it's supposed to. And again, I would want to rig this correctly. I would want to have, you know, the iron sights parented to the slide, and I would want to kind of reset the parenting of these objects so that the weapon was animatable. Since this is just going to be a display version of this weapon and not an animated working version of it, I'm okay with not actually doing any of that stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and put some sockets on this exactly where I intend them to go. Now, I did inside of Maya, when I was placing this together, put a couple of joints in the right place. Now, this is actually how I would do this for production, but since we haven't gone over placing joints on an object, I'm going to show you the alternative way of doing this. I'm just going to grab any component here. It doesn't really matter which one it is. I'm going to use body low, the main parent component, and I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to add a socket. I'm going to go and rename this socket, and I'll call it socket underscore barrel. This is going to be where I attach anything to the barrel. So I'm going to go move it towards my barrel. Now, I do want this to be pretty accurate. So switching from perspective to a viewport here that is going to allow me to line this up exactly where I want it is going to be pretty important. Now, this is why I typically do this inside of Maya, is that it gives me the ability to line this up in as accurate a way as possible. I can't actually zoom in any further here inside of Unreal, so that's going to be kind of as close as I can get it. I'm going to return to perspective, and I'm going to create a second rail, or a second socket, that I'm going to put on the rail. To do this, I'll grab the body again, I'll right click, I'll add socket again, and I'm going to go and rename this one as well. So this one is going to be called socket underscore, and I'll call it rail. This one too is going to go get placed accurately in the Picatinny rail. Again, I'm going to switch my camera view here until I can get this kind of exactly in the right place, close enough to it. I may move it out a little bit so I can line it up. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'm going to place it about there. Now, it's not the end of the world. In fact, I believe this is not going to work as intended here when I do this for the first time. We are going to need to adjust these things. And so I'm not going to worry too much about placing them exactly. We'll come back to that in a moment. Heading back to the blueprint now, the reason that we parented the static meshes to the weapon, the reason that they are children of that skeletal mesh, is because what this allows us to do is to grab an attachment and in its details panel find the sockets area and tell it which parent socket it belongs to. Here, if I use the little magnifying glass to search, you'll see that the two sockets I created are here at the top of the list. And actually, we can use a bone here as well as a socket, so we don't even need to use a socket proper. I'm going to use barrel socket here, and that's going to place our suppressor in about the right area. I'm going to reduce my camera speed here so we can go and get a much closer look at this thing. And that's not too bad. I can see that it wasn't actually screwed in, so I do need to move that back a ways. To do that, I'm going to return back here, and I'm going to take my socket and move it back into the weapon a little bit. We'll save this, and here you can see that that actually has worked and has brought the suppressor inside a little bit. Now, if I actually dock these or undock these windows and manipulate them in such a way that I can see both of them, you'll see here that we can actually go in fine tune this in a really nice way to get this to be kind of as accurate as we can get it. Next, we're going to grab our laser, our rail attachment, and I'm going to parent it to the rail socket. This puts it in the right place. However, unlike the barrel attachment, the position is fine. This one actually just has an orientation error. Here, I'm going to go to rotate, and I'm going to spin this 180, and that'll put the rail attachment in the right place. So we now have our laser kind of where it was intended to go. I'm going to go and save out our skeleton and close this. And now we have our attachments kind of set up in a way that we expect them to look. Now, I am also going to, there you can see there are little asterisks here beside some of my assets. That's because not everything has been saved. And I've done a fair amount of work here importing things. So I'm going to hit this little save all button, and it's going to list everything that I've gone and played with right now. So I'm going to go and save all of those. Excellent. The next thing that I want to do here is I want to be able to swap in bits and pieces of this at the user's discretion. Okay, and what this is going to do is it's going to give the user the ability to customize their weapon. To do this, I'm going to head to the construction script. This is where, when this asset or this blueprint is instantiated or created, it's going to run through this script and set this object up the way that we choose. To do this, head to the construction script, and everything that comes out of this node is going to fire off when this object is created. Since I have a couple different things that I want to do, the first node I'm going to create is called a sequence node. The sequence node is going to allow me to create a sequence of events that are going to happen once this node fires off. Now, this is not necessary, and we can actually wire things up in a very long sequence and have them work that way, but I prefer it and find it a little bit easier to read if I've got my sequences kind of set up in this way, where object 1, or object 0 in this case, fires off, and then number 1, and then 0, and so on. I find that a little bit easier to read. So the first thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want the user to be able to select which weapon they want to use. To do that, we need to set this skeletal mesh actor. I'm going to drag the skeletal mesh component into the graph. We get a reference to that component now. I'm going to drag out from that node, and what I want to set is the skeletal mesh component. So if I write set skell, you can see that it goes and identifies that for us. I'll select it, and then it's going to ask me which actor I want to use, and I'll go and use that 1911 that I imported. Out of 0, I'll go and plug into that. This means when this fires off, it's going to go and select the skeletal mesh. Now, you may have noticed when I use the drop down in here that I already have a Colt 1911 in my scene, and I also have an MPK5 or an MP5K that I created. Well, I'm going to give the user the ability to switch in between these weapons. Right now, when the construction script fires, it's going to go from the construction script into the sequence. It's going to find track 0 first, and it's going to go and set my skeletal mesh to be the 1911. There's no choice here. The user cannot change anything. This is just going to make that mesh the 1911. In order to add choice, we are going to go into the blueprints folder, and I'm going to create what's called an enumeration table. Here I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to blueprints. I'm going to go to enumeration. And in here, we're going to go and name this thing EN for enumeration underscore, and I'll call it weapon list. The nice thing about this is that this is expandable. For every weapon asset we create, we can add a new row to our enumeration table, and we can then make this thing work the way that we want it to work. I'm going to open the enumeration table, and here I'm just going to hit new twice. The default weapon I want the player to have is the Colt 1911. Now, this is just a string. It does not have to match exactly the name that your asset has. This is just a means for you, the developer, to identify this object. You can also go and give it a description here in case the name you give it is not enough to describe it accurately. I'm going to also write MP5K, and we'll give the user the ability to swap out to that asset. I'll save my enumeration list, and I'll close this off. Next, I'm going to add another enumeration list. We're going to go to Blueprints, Enumeration Data, and here I'll call this EN again for enumeration underscore, and I'll call it attachment list. Here, I'm going to open this up, and we're going to go and create a couple more things here. First, I know that the player's not always going to use attachments, so the first entry is going to be none. The second is the laser that I created, and I'll put that there. Now, I actually don't want to put the suppressor here, and that's because this attachment list is only for what goes on the rail. In fact, it would probably make sense to go and rename this rail attachment. Now, if you're only using a rail and not a barrel, then that's as far as it needs to go. I'm also going to create a blueprint, enumeration, and I'll call this EN underscore, and we'll call it rail attachment. Here, we'll go and add 3 entries. First, again, none, because I want to give the player the ability to not have any kind of attachment on the rail. Second, the laser. No, I've done this incorrectly. I've got rail attachment here twice. So let's not do that. Let's rename this one barrel. There we go. So in the barrel attachment, there, we're not going to have 3 of these things. We're going to have 2. So none and suppressor. Excellent. Rail attachment list. I'm going to go in here. I actually have another attachment I've imported. So I'm going to hit new and I'm going to add that as well. This is my Seymour scope. And I'll put that in there. So now let's use these enumeration data tables inside of our blueprint to make this work. So now, instead of just defaulting this weapon, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a switch on Enum. This is going to be my weapon list. So I'm going to switch on Enum weapon list. Now you can see I've done this before, and I do have another Enum here. So I want to be careful that I use the right one. I'm going to plug this in here. And now, if the selection is Colt 1911, we can set our mesh to be the 1911. If I move these guys up and hit Control W to clone them, I can also take the HK MP5K, plug it in here. Now I know this is the wrong Enum list because I didn't call it HK this time, but I'm going to go and put this on the MP5K. Let's go use the right switch on Enum. So we're going to go and switch on Enum and underscore, switch on Enum underscore, and it looks like it's this one that I want to have. There we go. So we'll go and delete that one. I don't have unique names from the first time this was created. So there we go. So now we have Colt 1911 and we have just MP5K. After it selects which weapon we're going to be using, we need to then do another switch. This one is going to choose our rail attachment. By default, I want it to be none. Okay, so here's the rail attachment. I'll drag it out to get a reference to it. I'll drag out from the reference and I'm going to set. Now in this case, it's not a skeletal mesh. It is a static mesh. So I'll set the static mesh component of this asset. This is going to be none. This means that when the selection is set to none, this won't set a static mesh. It'll actually clear it. I can clone this with Control W twice. And now, if we choose the laser, we can add the laser. If we choose the Seymour scope, we can choose the Seymour scope. Excellent. I need my barrel attachment as well. Now I've run out of nodes in the sequence. So I'm going to hit the add pin. And now we have a third entry, which I'll pull down here as well. And this too is a switch on enum underscore, in this case, barrel attachment. I'm getting a little bit of crossed noodles here. The wires are getting a little bit confusing to read. So I'm going to double click on the wire to create what is called a reroute node or a reroute node. And I'm just going to move this kind of down and out of the way. I'm going to use this to make sure the wires don't cross each other. That just helps it to be a little bit more legible. Here too, I'm going to bring out the barrel attachment. We'll pull out from here and we'll set our static mesh. And again, none is going to be the empty one. That way, we don't set a static mesh if we don't want one. I'll clone these using Control W, pull out the suppressor, and we'll add the suppressor. I'll hit OK. Now, if we go and take a look at this in the scene, and I'm just actually going to move my camera over here. I've already got one in the scene that we can see. I'm going to drag this blueprint out here, and we'll go and rotate it 90 degrees, and we'll rotate it back here 45 degrees or so. And I'm just going to move it up so we can see it. So here's the weapon. And what we should have here is we should have the ability to go and change some of the properties on here. Now, you'll notice nothing in the blueprint gives us the ability to change this. Even though we've gone and set this up the right way, it hasn't actually given us any kind of input. So the reason for that is that these switch on enums don't have any input into them. This is just a drop down that we can't see or use. In order to use this, I'm going to make a variable that I plug in here. I'm going to right click on this and we're going to promote it to a variable. This variable is my weapon selection. So I'm going to type weapon selection. I'll promote this one to a variable. This one is going to be rail attachment selection. I'm just going to put rail selection. And then this one is our barrel selection. So promote to variable, put it up here, and we'll go and write barrel before the word selection there and save that. Now again, nothing is happening here. Even though I have now some variables that have a drop down where I can choose what they are, we're not getting access to them outside of the blueprint. In order to do that, we need to make these global variables. We do that by just opening the eyeball beside them. This is going to make them visible outside of the blueprint. And now you can actually see in my default selection here, I now have the ability to swap out the Colt 1911 for the MP5K. I have the ability, you can see the rail is empty at the moment. I can go and put the laser on the rail, and I can go and put the suppressor on the barrel. Now I'm going to set these back to none. Let's go take a look at what happens with the MP5K. I'm going to move this over, and my prediction here is this is going to break. I'm going to put the laser. You see it doesn't go where it's supposed to. And I'm going to go put the suppressor, and it also doesn't go where it's supposed to. The reason for that is that we have not set up our sockets on the MP5K to match the way that they exist on the Colt. So I would need to go and do that as well, putting the little icon or the little socket indicator at the front of the barrel, and then going and putting the rail in the right place. I can go and do that here. I've got my MP5K asset right here. And I can go in, I actually have sockets here already. They are in the right place. They just have the wrong name. So if I go back into the meshes here and open this one up, I can go and take a look at those names. So socket barrel with, for some reason, a capital A. And I'll go and put that on the socket, what I originally called muzzle. And we're going to create a socket here and paste that. And then the other socket name was socket rail, which again, I'll copy and I'll go and just rename this one to the same name. So again, now this should work. So if I switch from laser to Seymour, you can see it pops up in the right place. The suppressor popped into the right place as well. Now the Seymour is not actually going to work well with the 1911. It shouldn't have an upside down scope here in the 1911. So I should actually check to make sure that I'm allowed to use the Seymour scope. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to need to check and see what my weapon selection is. So if I take that node down here. There's my weapon selection. I'm going to pull out of here and I'm going to type equals enum and 1911. So this is going to return true or false. This is a Boolean. And if this node is set to 1911, then I'm going to tell it that the Seymour should be nothing when I equip it. So if I move over here, we're going to move these guys back. It's the only one that I actually want to have nothing. So I'm going to create a branch, B. We'll plug that into the Seymour. The branch is going to check the condition of what weapon we're using. And if it's the 1911 true, then we're going to go and switch this back up into the none. If it's not the 1911, then we can actually use the Seymour. So if I save this, this shouldn't allow me to put the Seymour on. So I can put the laser on, it works. I can put none on, it works. But I can't put the Seymour on. You'll see that it doesn't actually do that. Now, I should also, when I leave here going into the rail attachment, I should also set the attachment here to be none so that it doesn't say Seymour when it's not actually there. So to do that, I'm going to go and put a set in here. So if this is the 1911, which is true, and it goes into the Seymour, it's going to go up here and set it to false. It's in this branch that I need to make a set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the rail. We'll go and pull this out and set, and we're going to set it to none. So this will go into none, which will go into here. So what that should do is it shouldn't allow me to actually see Seymour written here. So if I save this like that, and I try to choose the Seymour from the list, you can see that it doesn't allow me to do that. So now if I go to MP5K and I put the Seymour on, it works just fine. If I go to the 1911, the Seymour actually pops off and it gets reset to none. So excellent. I now have a very simplistic script here set up in order to do this. In order to set this up, I've got my materials set up. I've got my blueprints set up. The only thing that I have left to do here is to create some kind of an interface for the user. Right now, the user is not going to get access to these little nodes here. The user is only going to get access to whatever we expose to them. So right now, this is for developers, not for gamers. So in order for gamers to do this, we're going to need to create some kind of an interface. In the next video, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at creating some UI where we can use some drop-down menus and things like that and go and create the interactivity between these components. For now, we'll leave it just like this. So we have our MP5K. I can throw the laser on it. I can throw the Seymour on it. I can throw the suppressor on it. Again, it looks like it probably should be recessed a little bit more. We can go and try and adjust that here. We'll go on the skeleton. I'll dock this down here. Let's go grab that socket. And we're going to go and just move it again backwards in here. Now I'm going to have to go and update this in order to make it work. So none, and then suppressor. There we go. I'll pull it out just a little bit. There we go. So there. Now we've got a nice little customizable weapon system that, again, is only really just missing the UI here to get this to work. Everything else is working quite sharply. And we can set this up in all kinds of different ways, depending on how we wire this thing together. We can set it so that when you choose the 1911, that everything gets set to none by default. And then you can go and add your attachments, right? So that if I go to the MP5K, it doesn't automatically put the suppressor on, that it's something you've got to go and add later. And again, we could have our own, set of suppressors as well. You can have 5 or 6 different suppressors in here. And that way this barrel attachment thing gets quite a bit longer. So there is that system. I hope this has been a helpful little video for you in getting this set up inside of Unreal. Like I said, stay tuned here for the next video where we are going to be putting together the UI, putting together the system that we are going to use in order to actually give the user the ability to cycle through this. The other thing we are going to add is then some custom paint schemes to the weapons as well. I want the user to be able to select a different paint job depending on, what their mood is like. So we have some customizations. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope to see you next time in the next video where we create some UI. And until then, keep on creating.